Deep in the Alabama countryside, there was a mansion that locals refused to speak of. They whispered of a pact made inside its walls, a pact born from paranoia, betrayal, and a husband's hunger for control. Some say 5 enslaved men entered that house one night and walked out with power they never asked for, tied to a woman who never deserved the fate forced upon her. What happened in that mansion wouldn't stay buried forever, because evil like that leaves stains on land, on memory, and on every soul it touches. The mansion stood like a fortress against the dying Alabama light, its white columns throwing long skeletal shadows across the earth as dusk sank into the fields. The Caldwell estate was built to endure, to dominate, to remind everyone who saw it that one man's will could shape both land and flesh. From the polished mahogany floors to the endless cotton rows that glowed ghostly under the evening haze, everything bore the mark of Colonel Thomas Caldwell's rule. The man had spent his life tightening his grip on the soil, on his workers, on his wife. Yet power, like rot beneath the paint, was beginning to show through the cracks. Inside the mansion the air was thick with polish and dust, smelling faintly of oil lamps and control. The colonel paced his study, boots clicking against the floor like a clock counting down to ruin. His walls were lined with trophies of conquest, sabers, medals, portraits of grim ancestors whose eyes followed him wherever he went. He had inherited their arrogance, but not their restraint. Every thought that moved through his mind was heavy with suspicion. He felt it growing in the fields, in the murmurs that passed between those who served him. The fear that had once ensured obedience was curdling into something else: resentment, hunger, the quiet stir of rebellion. His wife Eleanor was upstairs, a figure of elegance shaped by years of obedience. Her beauty had once been her husband's pride, her presence a trophy of refinement and control. Yet even she had begun to slip beyond his grasp. There were moments now when her gaze lingered too long out the window, watching the horizon instead of him. Her hands, once delicate and compliant, had grown restless. She was no longer just his possession. She was a reminder of what he could lose, and that thought burned in him like a fever. In the study below, the colonel's mind turned toward a solution, one that only a man who believed himself untouchable could imagine. He told himself he was restoring order, reinforcing loyalty. In truth, he was feeding the same cruelty that had defined his life. He decided that night to make a pact, one that would strip everyone around him of the last fragments of their humanity. 5 men would be called to the main house, men he trusted more than the rest, men who had earned their survival through obedience. He would offer them something so vile, so unimaginable, that it would bind them to him forever. He poured himself a drink, the amber liquid trembling in his glass as he stared at his own reflection in the window. Outside, lanterns were being lit along the drive, each flickering light reflected in his eyes like small fires waiting to spread. He knew how to use temptation as a weapon. If fear alone could not hold men, perhaps degradation could. What was loyalty, after all, if not a currency to be purchased by the suffering of others? The door creaked open, and one of his overseers stepped in, a thin, nervous man who had learned long ago never to meet the colonel's gaze. The message was brief. The 5 men were waiting. The colonel nodded, dismissing him without a word. He finished his drink, set the glass down, and adjusted his collar before stepping into the hall. He walked with the rigid posture of command, his boots echoing down the corridor like gunshots in the quiet house. In the chamber beyond the dining hall, the 5 enslaved men stood together, their faces unreadable but their bodies tense. They had been called before, summoned to receive orders or punishment, and they knew the difference between a favor and a trap. Samuel stood at the front, older, calm, eyes that had seen too much. Behind him were John, Elijah, Marcus, and Thomas, each waiting in uneasy silence. The room was still except for the low hum of an oil lamp and the faint rhythmic sound of the colonel's boots approaching. He entered with a confidence born of absolute authority. To him they were not men but instruments. He began speaking in the same smooth tone he used when sealing business deals, the voice of a man who believed himself righteous even in depravity. He spoke of loyalty, of the importance of unity, of trust. He reminded them of the privileges he had allowed them: food, shelter, the avoidance of the whip. And then, with deliberate cruelty, he told them what he wanted in return. The offer was unspeakable. He would give them his wife, Eleanor, access to her body, her time, her very being, not as an act of mercy but as a means of binding them to him. They would owe him everything, even the filth of their own shame. It was not a gift. It was a test, a trap that would make them complicit in their own degradation. The silence that followed was unbearable. The men stared at him, their disbelief heavy enough to choke the air. No one spoke, no one dared. Samuel's thoughts spun through rage and disbelief, his stomach turning at the obscenity of what he'd heard. He understood instantly that this was not about pleasure or favor. It was about control. It was about making sure no one on that land could ever stand above the colonel again, not in body, not in spirit. When the colonel finally demanded an answer, his eyes cut through each of them like a blade. The unspoken threat hung thick. Refusal meant punishment, pain, and perhaps death. Acceptance meant survival. And so, under the crushing weight of that moment, Samuel gave the only answer that ensured the others would live. The colonel's smile was small and triumphant. To him it was done, the pact sealed, his authority restored. But he did not see what Samuel saw, the slow gathering of something beneath obedience. Something ancient, dangerous, and waiting. That night the house filled with celebration. Guests arrived in gleaming carriages, their laughter spilling into the air, while the enslaved servants moved like shadows among them. The colonel toasted his wealth, his legacy, his order restored. None of them knew that in the quiet rooms above, a woman was being sold without her knowledge, her fate written in the cold ink of a man's pride. Eleanor dressed for the evening, unaware of what was being arranged below her. Her hands moved automatically through the motions of civility, fastening her jewelry, smoothing her gown, but her mind was elsewhere. She had grown numb to the rituals of Southern gentility, the endless charades of hospitality that masked decay. She had once thought herself a wife. Now she was beginning to understand that she had only ever been property. Downstairs, Samuel and the others waited in silence. They had accepted what could not be refused, but none of them would ever forget the moment their humanity was bartered like coin. Samuel's jaw clenched as he looked toward the grand staircase where the colonel ascended to join his wife. In that instant, Samuel saw the beginning of something, the faint, invisible tremor of rebellion. It was not born from rage, but from a deeper, quieter realization. The colonel had not secured loyalty that night. He had ignited something else entirely. Eleanor appeared later in the hall, radiant and distant, her eyes scanning the faces around her as if searching for a reason to stay alive. The colonel's hand rested on her back, a gesture that looked affectionate to the guests, but felt like a chain. She smiled when expected, laughed when required, and drifted like a ghost through the crowd. Beneath the music and the clinking of glasses, the house felt colder than ever. Outside, beyond the lantern light, the enslaved stood in small groups, their eyes drawn to the great house on the hill. They could not see what was happening inside, but they could feel it. The way the air had changed, the way the night had turned heavy and watchful. The colonel's mansion, built as a monument to control, had become something else. A living, breathing witness to the moment its master overreached. Later, when the festivities ended and the guests had gone, the colonel retired to his study once more. He poured himself another drink, convinced he had restored balance to his world. The air smelled faintly of smoke and sweat. Outside his window, the fields shimmered under moonlight, each row of cotton bending like the bowed heads of those who worked it. He told himself all was right again, that loyalty had been bought and fear renewed. But in the dark beyond the veranda, Samuel stood watching the house. His heart was steady, his thoughts sharp as steel. The colonel believed he had sealed his rule, but what he had done was plant the seed of his undoing. The 5 men he had bound with his cruelty would one day rise, not as tools, but as reckoning. And when that day came, even the walls of the Caldwell mansion would remember the sound of his fall. The night deepened. Inside, Eleanor's candle still burned, the light flickering across her reflection in the mirror. Somewhere in that reflection she saw the woman she once was, the obedient wife, the silent beauty, and beside her, the faint outline of what she could become. Something stronger. Something no man could ever truly own. Downstairs in the colonel's study, the clock struck midnight. The sound echoed through the empty halls, counting down to an end that had already begun. Morning rose over the Caldwell estate with a pale, bruised light, pushing through the mist that hovered above the fields. The plantation awakened as it always did. Boots in the dirt, hands in the soil, breath drawn under the weight of another day. Yet nothing about this morning was the same. Something unseen had shifted in the night, like a beam settling in an old house just before it cracks. No words were spoken of the pact, but every step the men took carried the weight of it, and every quiet glance they exchanged carried its shame. Samuel moved through his tasks with steady hands. But inside him something old and buried had begun to stir. Not anger. Anger was familiar. What lived in him now was colder, heavier, and far more dangerous. Resolve. He had given an answer the colonel demanded, but he had not surrendered his mind. Even as he worked, he watched the house on the hill, knowing the true battle had only begun. Inside the mansion, Eleanor stood at her vanity, staring at her reflection as sunlight spilled across the floorboards. Her eyes looked different, hollow around the edges, not from fear. She had lived with fear for years, but from the dawning realization that she had become a commodity in her husband's schemes. The knowledge settled over her like a shroud. She had been raised to believe marriage was duty, obedience, silence. Yet nothing in her upbringing had prepared her for the depth of her husband's betrayal. She saw it clearly now. She was not a wife. She was an asset, a tool, a bargaining piece in a world ruled by men who loved power more than God, land, or flesh. She rose from her seat and crossed the room, touching the cold glass of the window. Below, she saw Samuel near the fields. He moved with a quiet dignity, shoulders squared, expression unreadable. He did not look at the house, but she sensed he knew she was there. A strange understanding passed between them. Not intimacy, not even friendship, but recognition. 2 prisoners, both owned in different ways, both searching for the crack in the wall. As the day wore on, the colonel prowled the estate with an air of victory, mistaking silence for control. He greeted neighbors with practiced charm, offered instructions to overseers, and carried himself as though the earth itself bent beneath his boots. But beneath his performance, cracks were widening. His wife avoided his gaze. His men worked without spirit. Even the house servants moved with a stiffness he chose not to notice. Tyrants often mistake quiet for submission, not realizing that quiet is where rebellion learns to breathe. Night returned, heavier than the last. The mansion glowed with candlelight, but the warmth of those flames never touched the people inside. Eleanor waited in her chambers, knowing the pact would soon send someone to her door. She sat on the edge of her bed, hands clasped in her lap, steadying her breath. She had spent years enduring, but tonight endurance no longer felt like survival. It felt like disappearance. and she refused to disappear. The door opened. A figure entered. Samuel. He stepped inside, closing the door behind him, and for a moment the room was silent, except for the faint chirping of night insects outside the window. Eleanor braced herself, but Samuel did not approach her. He kept his distance, eyes steady, not hungry, not ashamed, but filled with something she had not seen in a very long time. Humanity. He told her nothing, but she understood. He would not take what the colonel had demanded he take. Not tonight. Not like this. His presence was an act of refusal, quiet but immense. The pact had begun, but Samuel would not let the colonel dictate the shape of his soul. Eleanor exhaled, tension loosening in her shoulders. For the first time since the pact was sealed, she felt the faint flicker of control return. Not freedom, not safety, but choice. And choice in a cage is the first crack in the lock. Samuel left as silently as he had come, and Eleanor closed her eyes, letting the relief wash over her. She did not know what future awaited her, but she knew this. She would not be passive in her own ruin. The next day, whispers traveled the quarters. 4 men had gone to her before Samuel, each carrying the burden of the pact in their own way. Some had taken what was offered in shame. Others had hesitated, but all of them were changed. The colonel believed he had bound them to him, yet what he truly bound them to was each other, through guilt, through humiliation, through a shared wound that would one day become a shared cause. By the 3rd night, the air on the estate felt electric, charged with something none of them could name. Samuel gathered the men in secret, speaking to them in the quiet, unseen margins of the property. He did not use anger to move them. He used truth. They had lost their dignity because of one man. They had been turned against their own spirits for one man, and now they would reclaim both, not through rage, not through chaos, but through a plan that would end the colonel's reign at its root. At the mansion, Eleanor was changing too. The helplessness that once kept her silent was evolving into a different force. She began to watch her husband more closely, learning his habits, his weaknesses, his blind spots. Every monster has one. She only needed to find where he kept it hidden. The colonel, drunk on his illusion of control, never saw the shift. He had mistaken fear for loyalty and silence for victory. He did not understand that the moment a man tries to own another person's body, he invites that person to reclaim their own soul, with a vengeance. The Caldwell estate went to sleep once more, unaware of the storm gathering inside its walls. In the fields, Samuel lay awake beneath the night sky, eyes open, mind clear. In her chamber, Eleanor did the same, staring at the ceiling, feeling something she had not felt in years. Purpose. Both knew the same truth now. Survival was no longer enough. It was time to take back what had been stolen. The colonel had made a pact he believed would secure loyalty. Instead, he had signed his own undoing, and the house that once stood as a monument to his power was becoming something new. An altar upon which his empire would finally bleed. Night settled over the Caldwell estate like a veil of thick velvet, trapping the heat of the earth beneath it. Crickets droned in the distant fields, and the lanterns along the veranda swayed in the breeze, casting long, warped shadows across the white columns of the mansion. Beneath that quiet exterior, the house breathed unrest. Every worker felt it. Every heartbeat on the property moved to a rhythm of unease. The colonel slept comfortably, convinced that domination was the same as stability. But his control, once absolute, had begun to rot from the inside. Samuel had spent the day observing the overseers, noting when they changed shifts, where they lingered, and how often the colonel checked the grounds at night. He worked without drawing attention, his steps steady, his posture humble, but his mind was alive with calculation. A rebellion required more than anger. It required timing, precision, and unity. And unity could only be forged through purpose, not fear. In the slave quarters, the 5 men gathered around Samuel beneath the soft yellow flicker of a single candle. Their faces were worn, their eyes shadowed by guilt and exhaustion, yet something new had begun to surface beneath that weight, a fragile but growing resolve. The colonel believed he owned their bodies, but in pushing them beyond the boundaries of shame, he had awakened something he could not control. Men who have lost everything become men who fear nothing. Samuel spoke with clarity and quiet authority. They would no longer be instruments of the colonel's cruelty. They would no longer allow Eleanor to suffer alone under the pact forced upon them. They would take their dignity back, piece by piece. And when the moment was right, they would take the colonel's power as well. One by one the men nodded. The pact had bound them, but now that bond would be turned against the man who created it. In her chamber, Eleanor stood before the mirror, unfastening the last pin from her hair. Her hands trembled at first, but the trembling slowed as she focused her breath. The scars on her spirit ran deep, and she knew they would never fully fade, but Samuel's defiance had changed something inside her. She no longer felt like a possession waiting to be claimed or discarded. She felt like a witness waking from a long nightmare. She moved to her writing desk and pulled out a small, leather-bound journal. For years she had filled its pages with thoughts she dared speak to no one. Dreams of freedom, confessions of dread, and desperate prayers written in the soft hours before dawn. Tonight her pen did not tremble. Tonight she wrote of resolve, of vengeance, of the life she intended to claim when the colonel's reign finally shattered. The house had ears, and Eleanor knew how carefully she must move. Yet in small, nearly invisible ways she began carving out her part in the plan. She learned the placement of the study keys. She noticed which servants the colonel trusted least. She began remembering which decanter he drank from the most, and how heavy his steps became after midnight brandy. She listened instead of endured, observed instead of obeyed. Every cruelty had taught her something about him. Now she would use those lessons against him. The colonel, oblivious to the shifting loyalties in his own home, continued entertaining wealthy neighbors and boasting about his estate. Nights of music and laughter filled the parlor while pain festered behind closed doors. He believed himself untouchable, guarded by wealth, law, and the weight of his own name. But arrogance is its own poison, and he was drinking deeply from it. Weeks passed, each day tightening the noose around his authority. Samuel moved between quarters, quietly building trust, reminding the men that power only lasts as long as people believe in it. Eleanor played her role flawlessly in public, silent, refined, dutiful, while her eyes stayed open. Together, without ever being seen in the same room, she and Samuel steered the house toward its breaking point. The moment arrived on a night thick with summer heat. The mansion had hosted another grand meal, and the colonel retired to his study, laughing at his own jokes, unaware that the walls themselves were preparing to turn on him. Eleanor excused herself early, claiming a headache. Samuel watched from the shadows as overseers drifted to their quarters, bellies full, discipline lowered. When the house slipped into silence, Samuel signaled the men. One by one they moved with deliberate stealth toward the mansion, avoiding creaking boards and lantern light. Samuel knew the risks. If they failed, death would be a mercy compared to the punishment awaiting them. But if they succeeded, everything the colonel built on their backs would fall in a single night. Eleanor waited by the side hall as planned, her pulse racing. When Samuel reached her, they did not speak. Words were no longer necessary. She led them through the servants' corridor to the door of the study. From inside came the faint scratch of the colonel's pen and the clink of a glass. Samuel gave a single nod, and the men readied themselves. Eleanor stepped aside, spine straight, eyes cold. She had been used as a tool. Now she would stand as witness. The door was pushed open, and for the first time the colonel looked up and saw rebellion in the eyes of those he once owned. Shock flashed across his face, not fear. Not yet, because men who worship their own power never believe it can be taken from them. But his downfall had already begun. Eleanor held his gaze, no longer shrinking beneath it. Samuel stepped forward, and the house seemed to hold its breath. Everything that came next would burn the old world to ash, and from those ashes, the enslaved would decide their fate for the first time. The balance of power had shifted, and the walls of the Caldwell estate would never again echo with the same footsteps. The reckoning had arrived, not in chaos but in cold, deliberate justice. The night had come when the colonel would finally face the people he had broken, and there would be no pact, no threat, and no legacy strong enough to save him. The colonel rose slowly from behind his desk, confusion tightening his brow as he tried to make sense of the sight before him. 5 men stood in his study where they did not belong, and behind them his wife, silent, composed, unflinching. The glass in his hand trembled before he set it down. For the first time in years his voice did not fill the room. His authority, usually so swift and crushing, hung suspended, unable to find its footing. Samuel stepped forward. The colonel expected pleading, apology, some pathetic attempt to explain away their intrusion. Instead he saw only resolve, steady and focused, reflected in the eyes of men who no longer feared him. The study, once his throne, now felt smaller. The walls leaned inward. The air tightened, as though the house itself had been waiting for this moment. The colonel's jaw tightened as he searched for his voice, but Samuel did not allow him the illusion of control. No raised tones, no desperate energy, only a quiet, immovable certainty. They would not obey him anymore. They would no longer carry the burden of his bargains, his humiliations, or his name. They had gathered not to request or negotiate, but to end what he had built on their backs. The colonel tried to summon anger, the same anger he had used to break so many spirits. But fury requires confidence, and his confidence began to slip the moment he realized Eleanor would not look away from him. Her eyes, once dimmed by obedience, now held a steady and piercing clarity. She no longer resembled the ornament he used to parade before guests. She stood like a witness, free of his narrative, ready to judge him with the truth he spent years burying under charm and brutality. He moved a step toward her, perhaps expecting her to shrink as she always had. But Samuel shifted, blocking his path, not with violence, not with bluster, but with presence. The colonel froze. The moment Samuel stood between them, the old order died. A master does not exist when the enslaved no longer bend. For the first time in his life, Colonel Caldwell felt the sensation he had inflicted on others for decades: helplessness. His voice, when it finally returned, held a tremor of disbelief. He tried to command the situation back into shape, to remind them of their place, to assert the hierarchy he worshipped. But his words, so familiar in their cruelty, had lost their power. Words cannot control those who no longer consent to fear. Samuel stepped closer. The colonel reached for the pistol on his desk, reflex born of entitlement, but Samuel was faster. The gun was lifted from his reach and cast aside before his hand even closed around it. The room shifted again. The colonel was unarmed, not just of weapons, but of the myth that had shielded him for so long. Without obedience, he was just another aging man in a fine coat, stripped bare of illusion. Eleanor moved past the men and approached the desk. The colonel watched her, his face constricting in disbelief. She had always been the silent witness, the loyal wife, the well-kept possession. But possession cannot govern a soul, and he finally saw what she had become, without his shadow distorting her shape. She rested her hand on the edge of the desk, steady and unbroken, and he understood, too late, that she was no longer part of his story. She stood with those who sought freedom, not with the man who built their cage. Samuel gave the signal. The men seized the colonel, not violently but firmly, decisively, with a restraint that reflected their character, not his. He struggled at first, spitting empty threats, cursing their names, invoking law, God, and legacy, but authority means nothing when no one accepts it. He was dragged from his study, down the grand hallway he once marched through like a conqueror, past portraits of ancestors who had sown the same poison into the soil. Eleanor followed, her footsteps calm and even. She did not flinch as the colonel hurled insults over his shoulder. The words no longer touched her. With each step, the house seemed to shed its silence and breathe in something new. Justice does not always arrive with noise. Sometimes it walks in quiet, measured strides down a hallway built to intimidate and renders that hallway powerless. They brought him to the cellar beneath the mansion, the same place where chains had hung and punishments had been whispered into being. Now the darkness would hold its maker. They locked him behind the same iron that once threatened others. He rattled the bars, his voice scraping the air, but the sound carried no authority, only desperation. Samuel remained outside the cell, not gloating, not taunting, simply watching, ensuring there was no mistake. This was not revenge driven by chaos. This was justice built on dignity reclaimed. When the colonel finally fell silent, realizing that fear no longer moved the men before him, he turned his eyes toward Eleanor. For the first time she looked back without lowering her gaze. Everything he had used to break her, status, oath, expectation, ownership, lay dead between them. She did not speak. She did not need to. The truth stood on its own. They left him there in the dark, raging against a world that refused at last to bow. Upstairs, the house exhaled. Windows were opened, candles were extinguished. The men dispersed across the estate, whispering to others what had been done. Not a shout, not a riot. A quiet spread of truth. The colonel had fallen. His power, built on bodies and silence, had shattered under the weight of those who refused to kneel. Near dawn, Eleanor and Samuel stood on the steps of the veranda. The horizon was still dim, but the first hint of sunrise traced the edge of the fields. For the first time in years, the land felt open. The soil no longer lay beneath a single man's boot. Samuel said nothing, and Eleanor did not look away from the emerging light. Freedom is not always loud. Sometimes it begins in stillness, in breath, in the realization that morning has arrived and the night can no longer command the world. Behind them, the Caldwell mansion loomed, unchanged in structure, but transformed in purpose. A house that once devoured the lives inside it now stood as a monument to its master's collapse. And in the basement, the colonel, clutching iron bars like a drowning man, finally understood the truth. Power taken by force can be lost in a single night when the oppressed choose to stop surrendering. The reckoning was not the end. It was the threshold. Morning broke slowly over the Caldwell estate, as though the sun itself approached with caution. A thin golden light stretched across the fields, touching the earth that had known too much blood, sweat, and silence. For the first time, the day did not begin with commands or the rhythmic bark of overseers. The fields waited, but no one rushed to them. There was a hush, strange, tender, uncertain, settling over the land like early dew. Samuel walked the perimeter of the grounds with measured steps, not as a servant, but as a man who carried a decision heavier than any chain. The colonel was locked beneath the mansion, and the plantation was theirs, at least for this moment in history. But moments of freedom can be as fragile as frost. They melt if not protected. He knew the world outside these gates would not forgive what had happened. Laws, sheriffs, slave catchers, plantation neighbors, and newspaper ink. All of it existed to keep men like Samuel in the dust. If the colonel ever escaped or was found, the story would be twisted into something that justified retaliation. This place, though briefly liberated, could never be their future. Samuel watched the fields sway with the wind. For years that wind had felt like a taunt. Today it whispered possibility. Eleanor stepped out onto the veranda, skirts brushing the wood beneath her feet. The morning light softened the hollows of exhaustion beneath her eyes. She looked out over the estate, the land that had been her gilded cage, and for the first time she saw it not as inheritance, but as aftermath. Everything her life had been built upon was broken. She did not mourn it. She only mourned the years spent inside its shadow. Samuel joined her at the top of the steps. They did not speak. They didn't need to. Between them existed a shared knowing. What had happened could not be undone, and what came next must be chosen, not drifted into. By midday, the news traveled through every cabin, every worker, every family on the estate. The colonel would not return to power. There would be no more nights of dread, no more footsteps to flinch from, no more commands delivered through violence. The relief was real, but relief is not the same as direction. The question now pressed upon them all: where do we go from here? Near sunset, Samuel gathered everyone in the clearing beyond the cotton barns. The workers formed a ring beneath the shade of sprawling trees that had stood longer than any Caldwell. Children clung to their mothers. Men who had endured decades of dehumanization stood shoulder to shoulder. Samuel addressed them with the same quiet conviction that had led them to this turning point. They could not remain here. Even with the colonel caged, the land itself bore the weight of his name, and names could summon danger from miles away. The world beyond the property line was waiting, and it was hostile. But beyond danger lay something they had never been given: choice. Those who wanted to flee north could leave that night. Those who wished to stay long enough to gather supplies and plan a safer route would have Samuel's help. No one would be forced, not by Samuel, not by Eleanor, not by any man again. When he finished, a hush clung to the clearing. Then, slow, cautious nods rippled through the crowd. Eleanor remained at the edge of the gathering, a quiet figure draped in twilight. She had no place among their futures, and she knew it. These people needed to build lives without chains, literal or symbolic. Her presence, tied to the Caldwell legacy by blood and paperwork and law, would only endanger them. She accepted this without bitterness. To free others, sometimes one must stand alone. That night, lanterns glowed in windows one last time as families packed what little could be carried: bread, cloth, tools, memory. Near midnight, a small group set out under Samuel's guidance through the trees that bordered the road, silent, determined, stepping into a darkness that held more hope than daylight ever had. At the mansion, Eleanor stood at the top of the staircase, watching the last of them disappear beyond the tree line. Samuel was the last to leave. He paused at the bottom of the steps and lifted his gaze to her. Their eyes met in a moment without claims or promises. Just truth. She nodded once. He returned the gesture. Then he was gone, swallowed by moonlight and the uncertain road ahead. The house behind her felt cavernous and strange. Rooms that once echoed with forced obedience now lay unbearably quiet. Eleanor walked through each hallway and opened every window. She stripped the mansion of its silence, letting the night air wash through, cleansing what could be cleansed. Then, with a single oil lamp in hand, she descended into the cellar one last time. The colonel sat against the wall, shackled, eyes burning with hatred and disbelief. He still rattled his chains as though noise could restore his kingdom. Eleanor stepped closer, not as his wife, not as his property, but as the final witness to the empire he had built upon bones. She did not speak. Words were too small for what he had done to so many. Instead, she set the lamp on the ground just outside the bars, turned and walked away. When she reached the top of the stairs, she did not look back. Upstairs, she moved through the mansion with calm purpose. She gathered only what she needed: documents, keepsakes, a small bag of belongings, and stepped outside into the warm night. The stars hung bright over the fields as cicadas sang through the darkness. The estate stood behind her, massive and pale in the moonlight, a monument to a legacy that deserved to end. Eleanor struck a single match. She dropped it onto the trail of lamp oil she had poured through the hallways, across curtains, beneath portraits, and along the wooden floors. The Caldwell estate caught fire like dry tinder, hungry for release. Flames crawled up the walls, devoured the drapes, and licked at the columns that once guarded its doors. The house groaned, boards splitting, glass shattering. Light roared through every window until it looked as though the mansion itself had swallowed the sun and choked on its own fire. Eleanor stood at a distance, face illuminated by the blaze. She did not cry. She did not tremble. She only watched until the roof collapsed and embers showered the night like burning stars. By dawn, nothing remained of the Caldwell legacy but ashes and a scorched foundation. The Colonel's voice, once thunderous, would never command another breath. Eleanor turned her back on the ruin and began walking east, toward a life unclaimed, unnamed, and unwritten. In the end, history would not remember Colonel Caldwell as a great man, nor would his wealth or pride be preserved in storybooks. His legacy vanished in smoke. But those who escaped, the men, the women, the children, would carry forward a future he tried to deny them. And Samuel, somewhere on the road ahead, would walk not as a slave, but as a man who had reclaimed his soul. Justice did not arrive with glory or triumph or applause. It arrived in silence, in ash, and in the unshackled breath of survivors who finally owned their own lives.